back to 3 good, 3 bad, and this time it's the turn of the Panasonic S5. Released in September 2020, this was part of Panasonic's move to full-frame mirrorless cameras. But the big question for many of us is, should we upgrade from the GH5? Should we wait for the GH6 or maybe invest in the GH5 Mark II? Well, we took the S5 out onto the streets of Bury St Edmunds in England, which is our local town, to see how good this camera really is. All of the footage you're about to see was shot in 4K with 10-bit 422 colour using Vlog. I could tell you about how St Edmund was the original patron saint of England, in fact not St George, and that's who this town's named after, but that's not what I'm doing here. I'm testing the contrast detection autofocus system on the Panasonic, and it's something that they've stuck to despite all the criticisms. And I have to say it's pretty good, but it's just not quite reliable like the Sony autofocus system or the Canon. So let's talk about the 3 things that I love about this camera. The first one is the size of it. It's tiny when you think that this is a full frame camera, and yet it's really no bigger than the GH5, at least for the 20 to 60mm kit lens that I've got on there, which is roughly equivalent to the 12 to 35mm on the GH5. Number 2 is the ergonomics. I really like where the buttons are, and there have been a couple of minor improvements just to simplify things and make it easy to use in your hand. One of the things that I liked was where the autofocus dial and button is. I found it really easy to just switch between modes like face tracking and area mode when I was testing out the autofocus. Number 3 is the ability to use this camera to shoot in mixed lighting conditions. Now you might think, well, that's obvious because it's a full frame lens and a full frame sensor, but coming from the GH5, where many of us went out and bought the Sigma 18 to 35mm art lens to compensate for the fact that you couldn't really go to 1600 ISO or above, you've got none of those considerations with the S5. And there's something to be said for that. If you are at an event, you've maybe got 2 lenses that you're going to change between, and you just need to get clean, good shots. You can with the S5. The first thing that I didn't like about this camera will not really surprise you. It's the autofocus. Now, Panasonic has had a bad rap for its DFD-based autofocus system. I do think it's much improved, and generally it worked, but at times it was confusing. You'll notice on the squirrel The head and the eyes are not in focus, but the tail is. I later realised there's a separate animal tracking function compared to the face tracking for humans. Also, as Liam walked towards me on the street, maybe it's my imagination, but I don't think his face is in focus the whole time. So it's pretty good, but it's not as good as my Sony A7S III. Having said that, the A7S III is pretty much twice the price. The second thing I don't really like about this camera are the time limits on recording in 4K. So if you wanted to record 10-bit colour 4K internally at 30 frames a second, you have a 30-minute cutoff. And that's also true for 4K 60, which would be 8-bit colour, so 420. That also has a 30-minute cutoff, as do the new anamorphic modes, which were added with a firmware update. The third thing I don't really like about this camera are some of the compromises that have been made on the hardware side. The biggest one for me is the use of a micro HDMI port. That doesn't work well if you're streaming or using an external monitor. You want a full-size HDMI port. Otherwise, you'll see the damage on that port and it's an expensive repair bill. This camera also has different speeds for the two memory card slots as well. So that might cause you issues if you wanted to record to both cards as a backup for higher frame rates. Hats off to Panasonic. This is an incredible camera for the money. It's only a couple of £100 more than the GH5 Mark II, and that's for a full frame camera. There are inevitably some compromises, but I also think we should mention that Panasonic have a history of investing in firmware updates. There's been some phenomenal updates, for instance, to the CX350, which is the camcorder range, and also to this camera as well, adding things like anamorphic. Finally, a lot of the positive points about some of the other cameras like the Sony range, Panasonic have been doing for years. For example, the screen that tilts, flips out, can be turned around for blogging. We've always had that. We had it on the GH5 and it's there in the S5. So if you don't have a big investment in another system, I would have a look at the S5. If you are invested in the Micro Four Thirds system, I'd be inclined to wait and see what the GH6 brings.